No treatment of legal structures would be complete without looking at trusts. Generally, they're not going to be used in terms of day-to-day or everyday business decisions that you make, but they can become an important part of your consideration about how you establish and operate your business or commercial affairs. So why don't we get into it? So what is a trust? Well, a trust is not a separate legal entity, right? There's no such thing as a legal entity of a trust, just like there's no such thing of a partnership. Instead, the idea is a bit more about of a relationship. It's where someone is managing property. That property can be physical property, it can be money, it could be a business, it could be a combination of those things, but you're managing property for someone else. And the historical roots go back to a time when there wasn't very good communication, and if someone went away, particularly a wealthy person, back in those days the way you held wealth was property, so you would have estates and businesses that would have to run. Now, if you went away to travel, someone would have to run it for you. And prior to the development of trusts, the only way you could do that was you would actually have to sign the property over to them. So they would become the legal owner. And then when you came back, they were supposed to sign it back to you. As you can imagine, sometimes the people who got the property signed to them didn't want to do that. And so that led to the Courts of Chancery, which you may remember from Module 4. The Courts of Chancery, which deals with equity or fairness, came up with this really novel concept. The core idea behind a trust is that there are two different kinds of ownership. There is legal ownership and there is equitable ownership. Legal ownership means you can deal in the property, you can sign for it, you are the legal owner. Beneficial ownership means the benefits of the property should go to you, right? So they're separating who can control something from who it should be run for, the beneficiary. That's the central idea that's actually going on in this trust relationship. Over time, trusts became more and more used to look after people who might not be in a position to look after themselves. So originally, it could have been that there were people who weren't allowed to own certain kinds of property. So you would normally hear about things like children couldn't own land, and for a long period of time, women as a class were not allowed to own land. But there are also lots of men, for instance, serfs and villains or foreigners couldn't own land. So there are a lot of people who couldn't own something. And one way around this was to have a trust. You would get someone who was allowed to own it to be the legal owner, but they would run it for this other group of people who weren't legally allowed to own it. So you would have to run the land and take the proceeds of the land for the benefit of whoever was the beneficiary. So that's the basic idea of the trust that continues to this day. So we often use trusts in family situations where when parents set up a will, they might say, if both of us die, we will set up a trust so that any property we own goes into that trust for a trusted person to run, the beneficiary. It may be a family member, say the grandparents become the trustees, and they will own the property for the kids, but then they will run that property. Like if it was a house that they rent out, the rent should be used to take care of the kids, and ultimately the trust vests and the property will go back to the children in this case when they get at a certain age, right? So that's the way it's used. It can be used for people who maybe lack mental capacity and a family wants to put aside money to take care of them, or there's a legal case where some money comes about to take care of someone who doesn't have the capacity to look after their own money. That's another case. But the main case they're used for is in terms of managing familial wealth these days. That's something we will look at as we go through. But that's the basic idea of it, where a trust comes from, what it is, and how it can be used. So to understand it a bit further, let's look at some of the technical aspects of a trust, and we'll use an example, a very famous example in Australian business. So as this diagram tries to demonstrate, the key idea of a trust is there is property and we separate the legal ownership from beneficial ownership. So someone owns the property and they deal with it on behalf of the beneficial owners or the equitable owners. Now you'll notice over here that there's this strange term, settlor. The settlor is the person who settles the trust, who sets it up. Now, the trustee is under all kinds of special obligations about how they run it. They have fiduciary obligations that they can only use the property for the benefit of the beneficiaries. They can't use the property for themselves. So one of Australia's richest people, Gina Rinehart, is involved in a dispute involving a family trust, the Hancock Trust, that are useful to understand how they get used and also some of the drawbacks that can come with trusts. So a fair while ago, Gina Rinehart's father was this guy, Lang Hancock, who was legendary in Australia at the time, and he had large tenements for mining in Western Australia and set up a business. Now, when he died, he set up a trust, the Hope Margaret Hancock Trust. And really what he was trying to do was look after the family, particularly his grandchildren. So the grandchildren here were John, Hope, and I know of at least one other daughter, Ginia. Okay, so these are the grandchildren, and then he put his daughter, Gina, in charge of the company. And the original idea was that the trust would end in 2011, and that was when the youngest grandchild would turn 25. And this is commonly how family trusts operate, because you don't want the kids to actually get the money when they're too young. That's what the settlor, in this case the grandparent, doesn't want to give it to when they're 18. Apparently when you're 18 you might spend it on some stuff that might not be the best use of the money. So they often hold it back till children reach a certain age, 25 or 30. There's a couple of reasons for that I won't go into. One, of course, has to do with just spending money, but the second is about marriages, which can dilute family wealth if there's a bad marriage early on. Whatever the reason, this is the way the trust gets set up. But what actually happens is, in this company, Gina was actually given, through the will, her own interests in the mining company, but a large number of the shares were put in the trust as well for the grandkids. But because she's trustee, she is the legal owner. That means she gets to vote the shares, right? Okay, hopefully you can start to see what's happening. By being trustee here, Gina, with her shares and the trust shares, now controls the mining company. I think it's Hancock Prospect. Anyway, there's been a large number of legal disputes. One of the central issues in the legal disputes is that the vesting time was changed from 2011 to 2068. Let's have a look. So through a number of mechanisms, this vesting period was changed from 2011 to the trust vesting in 2068. I won't go into the details. There was some things involving tax advice that said why you should do it, and beneficiaries agreed to some things under deed, etc. There's a whole lot of legal cases, but this is the main issue, right? It gets changed. And John, who's 45 in 2011, I think, says, I don't want to wait that long to get my share of the inheritance, and says, well, this was changed without our consent. And we end up with huge legal battles, which in the end has resulted in Gina stepping off as trustee. So hopefully you can see the trust was set up to protect the wealth of the family and to look after the grandkids, but then interests can start to collide. There are accusations about the trustee breaching their fiduciary duties. We see the change in date, how it's so tied to one of Australia's large businesses, and it causes huge internal family rifts. And that can occur at a small scale in a family trust. If one of the beneficiaries believes they should be getting their share and they're of a reasonable age, there can be all kinds of problems in a family trust. Because remember, once you sign the property into the trust, it's no longer the settlors. It is, in essence, owned by the beneficial owners now, not the trustee, not the settlor. So it's something that families have to be very wary of, particularly if there's any reasonable amount of wealth involved. In the end, it can lead to a fracturing of a family, as it has in this case. Now, I said that one of the reasons that they're used is to manage family wealth, as we can see there. But what's the main advantage in managing family wealth? Now, what I'm about to show you is not as simple as what it looks. I really want to say that, right? If you're ever involved in a family trust, you need to seek proper legal advice, proper accounting advice. There are all kinds of tax rulings, which means it's not as easy to do this as what I'm showing. But let's think about what actually happens if you use a trust in a tax-effective way. So let's just say I've got my business, Gavin's Rings, is running really well. In fact, we're turning over $1 million a year, and out of that $1 million, we actually make $400,000 profit. So to understand why this works, we need to understand how tax works in Australia. I'm not going to use real figures, but I'm going to use how our system works. Our system is called a progressive taxation system. So that means between certain amounts of money. That means as your income rises, the amount of tax you pay rises. So between $0 and $20,000, roughly in that area, you pay no tax. Then between $20,000 and $60,000, you might pay 33% tax. And then over $100,000, you pay 50% tax. So you pay more tax in these brackets of income. Right? What tax bracket are you in? That's how it works. So if I was running this ring business and I made $400,000, well, I would pay 50% of $300,000, because that's half the amount, over 100. I would pay roughly a third, between 40 and 100, so a third of $60,000, and then 20 to 40 is I'd pay a quarter of $20,000. This is how much tax I'd pay. I pay nothing for the first 20. I pay a quarter of, in this tax bracket, 20 to 40. Then I pay a third from 40 to 100, which is 60. And then I pay a half of this 300, which is $150,000 tax. So I would pay $175,000 tax, which would then mean in my pocket, or for my family, I would have $225,000 left. What's an alternative way that we can do this? Well, I could become the settlor, and I set myself up as the trustee with 4 beneficiaries, right? I have me, I have my wife, I have my son, and I have my daughter as the 4 beneficiaries. And I put the business, Gavin's Rings, becomes the property of the trust. So I run it normally. I'm the legal owner. But now what I can do is say, hey, we've got $400,000 left over in profit at the end of the year in this trust. I'm going to give $100,000 to each of the beneficiaries. And we can imagine, it's a little bit complicated than this, but if they're adults, etc., and they meet the tax requirements, etc., and we give all the $100,000, right, that works. And we know that for $100,000, we pay a quarter of the first 20, and then a third of this, which is 20. So this person would pay $25,000 tax, this person 25, this person 25, this person 25, which means there are 4 lots of $75,000 less. So we pay $100,000 tax in total, and we have $300,000 left in amongst the family members. You can see we've substantially increased the discretionary income of this family by using the trust this way. Now, as I've said, it's not as simple as that. Don't go setting up a trust, etc. You need advice. It has to be a real business. It can't be a job. There's all kinds of disclaimers, and the tax department looks at this. But this is, in essence, conceptually what's going on. You can also imagine that it can lead to disputes, right? If the children want to keep their money and not give it to you, you've lost control. So it's not as simple as what it sounds. But that's trusts. That's one of the main ways that they're used in the Australian environment. The advantages and the disadvantages. So hopefully we've covered the major advantages and disadvantages and purposes of a trust. We've only got one more core legal form to look at, the big one, the corporation.